Hello, and welcome to our AdamSmithWorks Paper Preview series, where we highlight papers related to the life, times, and ideas of Adam Smith. I'm Christy Lynn Horpedal, Assistant Editor at AdamSmithWorks, and today I'm talking with Alexandra Oprea about her recently published journal article, Adam Smith on Political Judgment, Revising the Political Theory of the Wealth of Nations. It's published by the Journal of Politics. I will include a link in our notes so you can read it yourself. Hello, Alex.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. This is a great idea.
Well, thanks for doing this. I've got just a few questions, but before we get to your paper, I want you to think back to your first encounter with Adam Smith or Smith's ideas, and tell me, if you can, what do you remember from the first time you encountered him? Love at first sight, instant dislike, confusion? What were those first impressions that you had?
So I really appreciate this question because it gives me an opportunity to think back to one of my earliest moments of joy and discovery in the academic profession. And I guess I was really privileged that this happened to me fairly early. I was in high school, maybe I think 11th grade, and a friend of mine gave me a Christmas gift that was Richard Heilbronner's book, The Worldly Philosophers. And it had this beautiful accounts of all of these great thinkers in the history of economics, not just Adam Smith, but Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, thinking about Thorstein Veblen, and all of them had these wonderful accounts of how our moral philosophy, the politics and the economics really fit together into creating these social structures and how to think about them. And I definitely remember thinking that Smith was this impressive and sophisticated thinker on things, politics, philosophy, and economics. As you might imagine, that vision kind of got redone over the years, and I got to see a much more caricaturized version of Smith, and I got to see the disciplines sort of fight out what version of him they want to see. But that's always, whenever I think back to it, it always makes me really happy to think about this vision of Smith I had. So I guess first, love at first sight would be the direction.
And what a nice introduction to be able to see him comparatively with all those other thinkers, to get a real feel for him, how he's different and how he's similar to other people. Well, thank you for sharing that. I will put a link to that book in the notes for anyone who wants to check it out for themselves. But fast forward to the present, this paper, it came out in 2022. It's on what you refer to as the political judgment problem. And the opening line of your abstract, which is a question, which I appreciate, is how should the ordinary citizens of commercial societies navigate increasingly complex political landscapes? So you mentioned global markets, specialization, manipulation by special interests. How do you go about answering that question in your paper?
So thank you so much for, again, for the opportunity to talk about a paper. We rarely get the opportunity to think a little more deeply about them. And as you note in the abstract, I was really interested in a problem that I think is with us today about the way that we as democratic citizens can make decisions on things as complex as financial markets, education, politics, and policy, things about public health, thinking about COVID today, given that we have somewhat limited training in our day-to-day lives and limited exposure to these things. And as someone who's oriented towards history, I really thought this is a good opportunity to go back to Smith, since he was at the origin of seeing the developments that created both commercial society and the more democratic liberal societies that we live in today. And so I argue that he's at least really helpful for us in giving us a diagnosis of what the nature of the problem is. Because for him, it's really this disconnect between what we do in our daily lives and what the state or politics requires from us. When you think about it in an agricultural society, for Smith, what you do in your daily life is you work in the fields and you have exposure to leadership in terms of what wars are started or ended by your political leaders. And that direct exposure really gives you some input into what to say. In commercial society, with division of labor, you might be working on a small task in a big chain of production, and politics demands knowledge of things that you have no exposure whatsoever to. And so as I see Smith putting the problem, you can work at this in two directions. One is you can really try to help your citizens become more informed, more knowledgeable of a large variety of fields. And I think that is the job of civic education. And he has a nice outline for how to do that. or you can try to tackle it from the other side, like try to simplify, especially if your role is one of a political elite politician or thinker like Smith or philosopher. Try to simplify the public problems such that they can become more accessible to individuals, and find the right kinds of heuristics, cues, and orientations that can make citizens make better decisions with less information. So that's basically the core thing I try to look at in the paper. And I won't go into much detail about how Smith does the second part, the lowering the cognitive burdens, but I think that's one of the really exciting possibilities he presents for us.
Thank you for that. So tough question of the paper preview. You're gonna try to engage in some Smithian sympathy with your critics. What do you think critics of your paper or critics of your suggestions might say or might argue?
So thank you. That's obviously a hard question that I don't always want to confront when thinking about my work, but it's an important thing that makes it better. So I would say the obvious first level criticism as a historical figure is, what can Smith really tell us about the complex democratic politics and the duties of a citizen living in the 21st century, when in his time he's dealing with very, very minimal participation of ordinary citizens in politics, and it's much more elite driven, much more aristocracy driven, and we're not really operating under the assumptions of mass participation. And I think that would be a very fair concern to have. And I by no means mean to suggest that Smith was really asking the exact questions that we are. But in the paper, at least, I try to take seriously the possibility that even without the right to vote on a large scale, ordinary people had a big say in how politics was being run in the 18th century. And one of the tools that I described there is this idea of clamor, these unruly, somewhat potentially violent public protests that a variety of ordinary citizens had access to get the government to pay attention to their needs. Most common examples would be labor strikes, workers coming together to demand certain kinds of responses from public officials, and in some ways threatening their reputation, at least if they don't abide by some of the public will, and in some cases even potentially threatening actual violence. And so Smith is aware that how people think about politics will influence what they're willing to protest and how strong those protests are going to be. And so it matters that they understand politics so that they can respond politically, even if they're not democratic citizens. So I would say that that's the first part of the paper really tries to take seriously, what does it mean to be an ordinary citizen exerting political power in that time? And I think clamor gives us a little bit of an answer to why Smith would have cared about these ordinary people's political judgments.
So I see you're using the word clamor, I think, in a pretty specific way, and it's different from just a riot. It's different from just unrest. Could you sort of kind of give us a definition of what you think clamor is and how it's operating in your paper?
Yeah, so I've tried to look at a few sources in the 18th century, but I'm mostly trying to get at what like Smith's particular understanding of where these things come in. And he talks about clamor in a bunch of different key political decisions. He's worried about it as a response to decisions in Britain about the American colonies. And he's saying, as the prime minister, as different ministers are making decisions, they worry about clamor. And so he seems to be suggesting here that it's organized movement, particularly not just of media, like people who are elites or have connections to the media, but ordinary citizens, almost sort of thinking about it, not really in the terms that we might think of today as civil disobedience, but a stronger form of disobedience. And I think part of the reason for this, of course, is that in that time, you didn't really have these legalized outlets. They didn't apply for permits in order to protest. All of that was illegal. But he's thinking, I think, mass organization, sufficient to garner attention. And I think in our template, it would be somewhere between an orderly, nonviolent protest and a riot. But I think it's very hard to get the exact modern terminology for this. And he certainly seems to think that it's important not just for the sheer physical force. He does compare workers to an overgrown standing army. So there's certainly violence potential, but I think he's really worried about it as public opinion. The fact that so many people coming together are expressing disapproval of particular policies seems to matter to politicians, whether they are directly elected by these people or not, on a fundamental human level. And I think his claim about sympathy would give an indication that we don't like to be seen by a large number of our fellow citizens as being in the wrong, even if they're not threatening violence. I'm not sure if that's getting at exactly what you're asking for, but somewhere between a riot and a protest, some form of disobedience that is relatively civil, but not within the confines of regular democratic politics.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, I hope people read the paper for themselves. I know in academia, sometimes it's a long time between when something gets published and when you started on the project. So I know you're probably working on something else right now. Could you tell us a little bit about a current project you're excited about?
Oh, of course. Thank you for the opportunity. So I have been thinking more and more about both of these directions. So a lot of my projects are in education and how we should think about the kinds of skills democratic citizens need and the kinds of opportunities children especially can get to develop these skills. And so I have a hopefully forthcoming soon book called Children Are Citizens that really explores the issue of what the state can do to get children ready for the tasks of citizenship, while also taking seriously what they can do in this intermediate stage of childhood, how to protect them as well as encourage them. But on the other side, I'm also working on stuff on political institutions and how to make the rules of the game a little simpler, or to make the rules of the game such that political parties behave in ways that make the task of being a voter a little simpler. And hopefully I'll develop that in a couple of papers, hopefully some that I can talk to you about in the future.
Are you mostly looking at the US or are you looking at other countries as well?
I think the US is an interesting template for a particular brand of very challenging political polarization. And I think there are reasons that have to do with the way that the electoral system's set up. It's a first past the post system where you care about winning more top preferences than anybody else. And so coming in second really doesn't matter. Whereas a system of proportional representation or a system of ballots where you rank candidates, such as might be popular in certain European countries, also in parts of Asia, that gives you an opportunity to maybe clamp down on the virulence of partisanship. And I'm really interested in these sorts of reforms. So it's a comparative global project with the idea of trying to help countries like the US make better choices in terms of their institutions, which I take to be very inspired by Smith and actually Condorcet as two great figures who thought about politics and economics and their connection.
Wonderful. Well, I hope we do get you back to talk about those projects when we have a paper for it. Lastly, I just wanted to see who you think we should invite on the paper preview next. You were recommended to us by Brianne Wolf, and I hope people check out her paper preview and her paper. Who do you think we should be looking at who's doing really interesting work in the field right now?
That is by far the hardest question you're asking me, because there's so many incredible Smith scholars working on every aspect of his philosophy, his politics, his economics. And so it gives me great joy to talk about some of them. I've chosen two, although there were many candidates. I think the first one I'll mention, it just came out, I believe, a few months ago, if not just a month ago. And it is by Edward Frame and Michelle Schwartzy, and it's called Adam Smith on Education as a Means to Political Judgment. And I think their paper does a fantastic job filling in that part of what does Smith ask of ordinary citizens in terms of what they can do to make better judgments and how can it facilitate their education, especially through compulsory education laws and specific changes to the way education is accessible to individuals. So I think that's a great paper that I highly recommend. And the second paper is by another author that I absolutely love. It came out a little bit longer ago in 2020. It's called Observed Without Sympathy, Adam Smith on Inequality and Spectatorship. It's in the American Journal of Political Science by Kristen Collins. And it really tackles fundamental questions in Smith and in our world today of socioeconomic inequality and political participation. So the paper really thinks about how the way we watch each other as fellow citizens, as fellow human beings, changes in an unequal society, and especially the kinds of problems of being a marginal figure that Smith began to be aware of. So thinking about social shame, being homeless, being a survivor of rape, these are marginal figures that Smith begins to orient us towards thinking about and has the apparatus to think through, but maybe doesn't fully carry through in its conclusion. So I think both of these are showing the range of excellence in Smith scholarship today, and I really hope you get to talk to the authors of both these papers.
Wonderful. Well, I will definitely reach out to them and hope we can have them for a paper preview as well. Alex Oprea is an assistant professor of political science in the Department of Political Science and the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program at UNC. Her work explores the politics, philosophy, and economics of education and the place of the young, especially children, within political communities. I think we actually got to talk about all those things today, so I'm glad we at least got them in. Thank you so much for doing this with us, and good luck with your work, and I hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much, and I've enjoyed the videos I've seen already, and I'm so excited for more.
Thank you, Alex.